I would like to turn to Professor Fair to actually give us remarks on Chabahar prospects, opportunities, and challenges. Thank you, Professor.
I'm going to be lazy. I'm not going to go to the podium. I hope that that's okay. So first, I wanted to thank Dr. Moradian and his colleagues at the Afghan Institute for Strategic Studies for inviting me here and to talk about this topic. I'm going to conclude my discussion with a request from all of you, namely, if you have specific ideas about how we can protect the viability of Chabahar from the Trump administration, and I'm not joking, I'm actually quite serious. I'm going to request that you contact me via email or via Twitter or whatever way that you have available. I was really quite pleased to hear His Excellency Ergashev from Uzbekistan talk about northern efforts at connectivity, and I think many of the comments that he made this morning will literally join up with some of the comments that I'm going to make this afternoon. I'm not going to say anything path-breaking or unknown here. I'm just hoping that in talking about Afghanistan from the point of view of economic viability, that I'll encourage people to think about what the international community can do here long after President Trump has done whatever it is that Trump is going to do. So I think we all know that for most of Afghanistan's history, it has been utterly dependent upon Pakistan for access to warm waters at the port, mostly in Karachi. And while it's pretty obvious that both countries could have benefited from robust trade, particularly after October 2001 in the US-led war here in Afghanistan, there could have been a lot of money that could have been made mutually between Afghanistan and Pakistan. But unfortunately, Pakistan has generally used access to the port as a way of coercing Afghanistan to behave in ways that are preferred by Pakistan. So what makes Chabahar so important is that if there is to be a viable port at Chabahar, Afghanistan has other options other than Pakistan. And of course, this is one of the reasons why Pakistan is so concerned about Chabahar. It's probably one of the reasons why we have a lot of attacks on the Zaranj-Delaram highway, is because the last thing Pakistan wants is a viable alternative to what it has to offer, a viable alternative to being coerced and pushed around by Pakistan. So I think many of you know that the agreement that India and Iran made in 2001 to begin collaborating on the port in Chabahar was briefly interrupted when Iran came under Chapter 7 sanctions and India stopped its activity. And this was, from my point of view, not as an American, but from the point of view of a scholar who cares about South Asian security, it's a very bad idea. Because when the Indians had stepped back from their activity in Chabahar, the Chinese stepped in. And the Iranians have been fairly clear that it's really indifferent as to who builds this port, but it's important that this port be built. And once those sanctions were lifted, particularly after the Obama administration working with our European partners and Iran forged an agreement, India returned to Chabahar with vigor. Chabahar is important to most of the actors in this region, albeit for different reasons. So obviously for Afghanistan, having an option that's independent of Pakistan is evident why Chabahar is so important to Afghanistan. For India, Chabahar is very important because Pakistan denies India access to its ground lines of communication, and therefore Chabahar in Iran is the only way that India can meaningfully access Afghanistan and the rest of Central Asia. Chabahar is also part of the North-South corridor, which India, along with Iran and Russia, have helped to build The idea there is that goods move into Chabahar, it goes onto road and rail transit north through Iran onto the Caspian, and then goods can transit onto Russia or even onto Europe. And obviously, Chabahar is important for Iran for reasons that are really quite apparent. India has also worked with Iran to build the road and rail connectivity from Chabahar to Afghanistan's Ring Road or Garland Road, whatever you wish to call it, so that goods can obviously move through Chabahar and up into Afghanistan, and then hopefully connect with these other northern connectivity projects as well. Now, I might also add that it's also obvious to anyone who's looked at a book, and if you've known me, I've been talking about Chabahar, as has Barnett Rubin, for many years now, because one of the reasons why the United States and our Afghan partners have been unable to put meaningful pressure on Pakistan is because this entire effort has been singularly dependent either upon access to Pakistani airspace, which is what Americans are primarily using to resupply themselves here, or access to Pakistani ground lines of communication, which are still being used largely to resupply the Afghan National Security Forces. So it has always been impossible for the Americans to put pressure on Pakistan when Pakistan has had all of this logistical leverage. You know, for anyone that cares about logistics, you will know that logistics will trump strategy anytime. And it's certainly debatable whether or not there's ever been a strategy in place here for Afghanistan. But what President Obama and our European partners and Iran did with the JCPOA, the so-called Iran deal, was that it opened up new opportunities, principally by rehabilitating Iran, bringing it back into the international community, but also by creating the opportunity for investments in Chabahar. When I was here, I think it was 3 years ago, there was a trilateral meeting that Davoud let me sit in on between the Indians, the Iranians, and of course the Afghans. And this was right at the tail end of the Obama administration. The Trumpocalypse had not yet happened. But even at that point, investors were very wary about putting their money into Chabahar, because even at that period, at the very end of the Obama administration, there had not been a clear signal from the United States that not only was this desirable, but in investing in Chabahar, you wouldn't run afoul of the United States. And of course, any enterprise that is dependent upon access to US banks would potentially find itself in a very bad position if this wasn't in fact sanctioned by the Americans. Needless to say, with the emergence of the Trumpocalypse and Donald Trump, Chabahar's future has become ever more imperiled. I won't belabor upon why Trump has withdrawn from the JCPOA. It has nothing to do with him having any particular interest in Iran. It has much to do with U.S. domestic politics. U.S. domestic politics, in particular, his evangelical Christian constituency, they have certain preferences towards Israel. These preferences towards Israel has dictated his position on Iran. So my inquiry here is really trying to get the different partners that are interested in sustaining Afghanistan over the long haul to think about mechanisms, investment mechanisms that will encourage investments at Chabahar, right? Because it's not just the port that you need to make a port viable. You need all of the associated businesses to create a business ecology that will make Chabahar a viable transportation hub. And without those investments, all you really have is a place where you can dock ships, but you don't have a place where you can vigorously engage in movement of cargo from the port onto trucks, onto railroads, and actually create a robust distribution network. So what I'm looking for is really creative ideas on how perhaps the European Union, perhaps China, looking for financial arrangements that are robust to American vituperative reprisals, right? I'm looking for clever ways where we can find the kind of investors that are needed to make Chabahar viable, even though doing so is going to run afoul of the Americans. And I'm going to argue that not doing so has even greater risks. For one thing, although President Trump doesn't realize it right now, what he's doing in Iran is bad for US interests in this region. It imperils Afghanistan's long-term economic survival. And why do I say this? I think most people are expecting President Trump to withdraw troops really whenever he decides that we're actually losing here, right? Because all he really cares about is winning or losing. So quite frankly, every morning I ask my husband before coffee, has Trump had a tweet storm about getting out of Afghanistan yet? Because that's probably how it's going to happen. And when we no longer have soldiers here, do you expect that this Congress, I don't even have enough adjectives that will bring enough contempt to the microphone to describe this Congress. Do you think they're going to keep writing checks? Right? Afghanistan cannot even pay for the recurring costs of keeping its government afloat. Right? We all know this. But Afghanistan does have resources. Right? At this point, I wish people would stop talking about the military and what it's doing, what the ANSF is doing or not doing. What I want you guys to leave this thinking about is Afghanistan economically is a ship that is sinking. You have resources in the ground, but you have to get those resources to the market, right? So if we could find a way to think about Afghanistan being economically viable, in some ways the security situation is a secondary concern to the economic situation. And why do I say that? I think all of us know the story of Najibullah, right? Najibullah was able to resist every single thing that Pakistan threw at him, even though there were no Russian soldiers here, right? But as soon as the last check in rubles came and was cashed, Najibullah was done, right? This is without some way of paying for this country, all of the blood and sacrifice that has been made by Afghans and its partners, it's lost. So I'm gonna ask China, for example, to consider, is it willing to basically tell the US government to take a hike and invest in making Chabahar a viable port? Are the Indians willing to stomach this? Because I don't see any evidence that the Indians have the capital to simply replace what the Chinese might be able to do. And I'm sympathetic to the Indian position, right? The Indians look at Chinese efforts all around its neighborhood, right? We have Djibouti, we have Gwadar, we have Hambantota in Sri Lanka, we have Chinese ports in Myanmar and also in Bangladesh, and they all have a very similar investment model, which is predatory lending, so that the Chinese can actually have access to that sovereign territory. Right? So I'm very sympathetic to India's concern, but I'm going to argue that unless China and India can find a way of putting this regional rivalry into a different place, and when it comes to Chabahar, all of our collective interests are going to be in harm's way in Afghanistan. So I don't have any great ideas on how we secure Chabahar from President Trump. But what I am saying, if any of you have any ideas, I'm working on a long-term project on this over the course of the next year, and I'm very interested in hearing your ideas. And you can email me any ideas that you have. If you have a think tank and you want to engage in long-term discussions, my email address is CCF33, that's Charlie Foxtrot. I should know Foxtrot really well. CCF33@georgetown.edu. Thank you.
Professor Fair, thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. I think you are really bringing something very, very important that we're going to ponder upon, and I'm sure that there's going to be discussions. Economic viability, something that truly at the end of the day probably is more important than political and security issues, and economy is definitely intertwined to actually even bring solutions to all of those challenges. The significance of Chabahar in the light of all the challenges that we have with Gwadar, and really at the end of the day how landlocked we are, and the discussions of railways was mentioned earlier this morning as well, but that's also going to be something long-term. So in light of all of those, Chabahar is really an issue of significance that we need to consider.